Good morning, Giant Central School District. It's another edition of Stories with the Superintendent, and today I have a classic character for you. This is Curious George Takes a Job. And all the Curious George books were written by the same author, H.A. Ray, and you can always find them in the library because they have this super distinctive cover, yellow like a banana, which is what monkeys like. So, Curious George Takes a Job. This is George, and he lived in the zoo. He was a good little monkey, but he was very curious. He wanted to find out what was going on outside of the zoo. And one day, when the zookeeper was not paying attention, George got a hold of the key from the cage. Look at him; he's pulling that key off the zookeeper's pocket. When the keeper discovered what had happened, it was too late, and George was gone. Where was George? They looked for him everywhere, but they could not find him. Poor George. George was hiding in the hay of his friend, the elephant, and finally the keepers gave up looking for him. George found a nice cozy spot to sleep under the elephant's right ear, and the next morning before the zoo opened, he got away very safely. So look at George is using that elephant's ear as a blanket. That's kind of fun. Once in the street, George felt a little scared. What should he do in the big city? Maybe he could find his friend, the man with the yellow hat, who had brought him over from Africa a long time ago. Only George did not know where he lived. There was a bus stopping at the corner, and George had never ridden on one. Quickly, he climbed a lamppost, jumped on top of the bus, and off they went. Oh, my pages are sticking together. Now they were right in the center of town. There was so much to see that George did not know where to look first. If only he could go riding on like this forever. But after a while, George got tired and a little dizzy. When the bus slowed down to turn into a side street, George jumped off. There was a restaurant right in front of him. Something smelled good. Suddenly, George felt very hungry. And the kitchen door stood open and George walked in. On the table was a big pot. Of course, George was curious. He had to find out what was in it. Take a look, there he is. When the cook came back, he had a big surprise. Spaghetti was all over the place, and in the middle of it was a little monkey. George had been eating yards and yards and wound himself up, all in the spaghetti. The cook was a kind man and did not scold George much, but George had to clean up the kitchen and then do all the dishes. My, what a lot of them there were. The cook was watching George. "You're lucky to have 4 hands," he said. "You can do things twice as quickly." "I have a friend who could use a handy little fellow like you to wash windows. If you would like, I will take you over to him." So they went down into the subway and took an uptown train to the cook's friend, who was an elevator man in a skyscraper. "Sure, I can use you, George," the elevator man said. "I will give you what you need for a job. You can start right away. But remember, you are here for washing windows. Never mind what people say inside the house are doing. Don't be curious, or you'll be into trouble." George promised to be good, but little monkeys sometimes forget. That never happens to you, right? You never forget to behave. George was ready to start. My, how many windows there were, but George got ahead quickly since he worked with all 4 hands. He jumped from window to window, just as he had once jumped from tree to tree in the African jungle. For a while, George stuck to his work and did not pay any attention to the people inside. Of course he was curious, but he remembered his promise. Look at all those windows. In one room, a little boy was crying because he did not want to eat his spinach. That little boy's name was Mr. B, because Mr. B does not like to eat his spinach either. And George did not even look, but went right on with his work. In another room, a man was taking a nap and snoring. George was sorry. It was not his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He listened to the funny noise for a while, then went on working. But what was going on here? George stopped working and pressed his nose against the window. 2 painters were working inside, and George was fascinated. Painting looked like a lot more fun than washing windows. The painters were getting ready to go out for lunch, and the minute they left, George climbed inside. What wonderful paints and brushes they had. George could not resist. An hour later, the painters came back. They opened the door and stood there with their mouths wide open. The whole room had changed into a jungle with palm trees all over the walls and a giraffe and 2 leopards and a zebra, and a little monkey was busy painting himself on one of these trees. Then the painters knew what happened. Luckily, George was close to a door. He ran out as fast as he could, and after him ran 2 painters, then the elevator man, and then the woman who lived in the place. "Oh, my lovely, lovely room," cried the woman. "Don't let him get away." And George headed for the fire escape. Uh-oh, look at them all chasing him down the fire escape. George reached the end of the fire escape. The others had not caught up with him yet. Here was his chance. They could not jump, but George could easily jump down and escape. In a moment, he would be safe. Poor little George. He had forgotten that the pavement was hard as stone, not like the soft grass of the jungle. Too late, too bad. The fall broke his leg, and an ambulance came to take George to the hospital. "He got what he deserved," said the woman, "making my apartment into a jungle." "I told him he would get into trouble," the elevator man said. "He was too curious." George had to lie in bed with his leg high up in a plaster cast, and he was very unhappy. And it had all started out so nicely. If only he had not been curious, he could have had a lot of fun. Now, it was too late. But next morning, George's friend, the man with the big yellow hat, was buying his newspaper. Suddenly, he got very excited. "This is George," he shouted when he saw the picture on the front page. Quickly, he read the whole story and then ran to a telephone booth to ring the hospital. "I am George's friend," he said to the nurse who answered the phone. "Please take good care of him so that he will be better quickly. I want to take him to a movie studio and make a picture about his life." What he means a picture is a movie. It's a word they used a long time ago to say a movie. "A picture about his life in the jungle. Don't let him get into any more mischief until I can take him away." And you may notice he's talking on the phone in a telephone booth. And that's what people used to use when they weren't at home to call somebody because cell phones didn't exist. So finally, the day came when George would walk again. "Your friend is going to take you away this morning," said the nurse. "Just wait right here for him and don't do anything. Don't touch anything." And as soon as George was alone, he looked around at all the strange hospital things. "I wonder what is in this big bottle." George was very curious. It smelled funny. Suddenly his head began to turn, and then he felt as if he were flying. And then rings and stars danced before his eyes, and then everything went dark. And it's a bottle of ether, and ether is what doctors used to use to put patients to sleep before they did surgery so they didn't feel the surgery. So he opened that bottle and it made him go to sleep. And this is how the man with the yellow hat found George when he came to call for him. They picked him up and shook him, but they could not wake him. He was so fast asleep that when they finally had to put him under the shower. How surprised he was when he woke up. They had to put him under the shower to wake him up. George said goodbye to the nurse and the kind doctor, and then he and the man with the yellow hat got into the car to drive to the movie studio. And in the president's office of the movie studio, George had to sign a contract. Now he was a movie actor. In the studio, George was kept so busy all the time he forgot to be curious. He liked the jungle they made for him, and he played very happily there. So here they are making the movie of him in the jungle. And when the picture was finally finished, George invited all his friends to see it. The doctor and the nurse and the ambulance driver and the man from the newspaper and the woman in the elevator and the elevator man and the 2 painters and the cook and the reporter and all the zookeepers of the zoo. Here they are lining up to see the movie. And now the lights went out and the picture started. The movie started. "This is George," the voice began. "He lived in the jungle. He was a good little monkey. He only had one fault. He was too curious." And that's the story of Curious George Takes a Job. He takes a job as a movie actor. So until next time, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and always lie in pride.